Jake Morrison thought he was just sharing a meal, a hungry boy, a bowl of soup, a simple act of kindness. But 72 hours later, when the dust cloud appeared on the horizon, he realized some gestures echo louder than thunder. The fence post had rotted clean through, and Jake Morrison was 3 miles from help when he heard the sound. That would change his life forever. Not the wind, not cattle, something else crying soft, weak, coming from the tall grass near Devil's Canyon where no child should be. September 1974. The Montana high prairie stretched endless in every direction, golden grass bending under a sky so wide it made men feel small. Jake had been working this land for 27 years, long enough to know every sound. That belonged here. This didn't belong. He dropped his tools and followed the sound. His boots crunching through dried buffalo grass. The crying grew weaker. As he got closer, like something giving up hope, then he saw him. A boy, maybe 7 years old. Native, curled up in a shallow depression, wearing clothes that had seen too many hard days. His lips were cracked white, his eyes were closed, but his chest still rose and fell in shallow, desperate breaths. Jake had seen plenty of hard things in his 43 years. Drought, disease, death. But something about this small figure so still, so alone hit him like a physical blow. He knelt beside the boy, his shadow providing shade from the merciless afternoon sun. "Hey there, son," he said softly. "Can you hear me?" The child's eyes fluttered open, dark, frightened, ancient in a way that no 7-year-old's eyes should be. Jake reached for his water canteen, supporting the boy's head as he helped him drink. Slowly, carefully, the way you'd water a dying plant. The boy drank like he hadn't seen water in days, which, Jake realized with growing horror, was probably true. "What's your name?" Jake asked. The boy whispered something Jake couldn't catch. Then louder, "Tommy." "Well, Tommy, I'm Jake, and you're gonna be okay." But Jake wasn't sure that was true. The boy was severely dehydrated, malnourished. His skin had the papery quality that came from bodies consuming themselves to survive. Jake looked around the empty prairie. No roads, no houses, no explanation for how a child had ended up here, alone and dying. But explanations could wait. Right now, this boy needed help. And Jake Morrison had never been the kind of man who walked away from someone in need. He lifted Tommy carefully, surprised by how little the child weighed. Like holding a bird, all bones and desperate hope. "My horse is just over that ridge," Jake said. "We're going to get you some food, some real help." Tommy nodded weakly against Jake's chest. The ride back to the ranch house took 30 minutes that felt like hours. Jake held the boy in front of him, one arm supporting him while the other managed the reins. He could feel Tommy's heartbeat fast and irregular, like a damaged engine trying not to quit. The Morrison ranch wasn't much. A modest house, a barn, some outbuildings. Jake worked it alone since his father died 5 years back. He made enough to get by, but he wasn't rich. Never would be. But he had food, water, a warm place to sleep. In right now. That made him the richest man in Montana. Jake carried Tommy into the kitchen and set him gently in a chair by the table. The boy swayed slightly, still weak, but his eyes were more alert now. "Let's start with something easy," Jake said, reaching for a can of soup. "Chicken and rice. My ma used to make this when I was sick." He heated the soup on his old gas stove, the familiar routine calming his nerves. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. A storm was coming, had been building all day. Tommy watched every movement Jake made, not with suspicion, exactly, but with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that survival meant paying attention to everything. When the soup was ready, Jake served it in a white ceramic bowl, added some crackers, poured a glass of milk. "Take it slow," he said, sitting across from Tommy. "Your stomach needs time to remember how this works." Tommy ate carefully, methodically, each spoonful deliberate, like he was afraid the food might disappear if he moved too fast. Jake watched him eat and felt something shift in his chest. Not pity, something deeper, something that felt like responsibility. Where were this boy's people? How had he ended up alone on the prairie? And why did Jake feel like this chance encounter was somehow meant to happen? Thunder rumbled in the distance. The storm was getting closer. "You can stay here tonight," Jake said, "until we figure out where you belong." Tommy looked up from his soup, those dark eyes holding questions Jake couldn't answer. But for now, questions could wait. For now, there was just a man, a boy, and a simple act of kindness that was about to ripple out across the prairie in ways neither of them could imagine. Outside, the first raindrops began to fall, and somewhere in the distance, drums were beginning to beat. That first night, Tommy slept in Jake's spare room on clean sheets that probably felt like luxury after whatever he'd been through. Jake lay awake listening to the storm and wondering what morning would bring. He'd tried asking gentle questions over dinner. Where was Tommy from? How had he gotten lost? But the boy just shook his head, fear flickering in his eyes whenever Jake pressed too hard. So Jake stopped pressing. Some stories, he'd learned, come out when they're ready, not before. Dawn broke gray and misty. Jake found Tommy already awake, sitting by the kitchen window, watching the horizon like he was looking for something or someone. "Morning, son," Jake said, starting coffee. "You hungry?" Tommy nodded, still quiet, still watchful. Jake made pancakes, the kind his mother used to make on Sundays. Simple, filling, made with care. Tommy ate like he was storing up energy for something. That's when Jake saw them, riders on the horizon, still distant, but coming this way, a lot of them. "Tommy," Jake said carefully, "you see those riders out there?" The boy looked, his face went very still. "Are those your people?" Tommy nodded slowly, then said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "They've been looking for me." Jake felt his stomach tighten, not from fear, exactly, but from the sudden understanding that this wasn't just about one lost boy anymore. The riders were getting closer. Jake could make out details now. Native men, some in traditional dress, others in modern clothes, all moving with purpose, a lot of purpose. "Tommy," Jake said, keeping his voice calm, "is there anything I should know before they get here?" The boy looked up at him with those two old eyes. "You saved me," he said simply. "That matters to my grandfather, your grandfather, Chief Standing Bear of the Crow Nation." Jake's coffee mug stopped halfway to his mouth. Chief Standing Bear, even Jake, who mostly kept to himself, knew that name. A respected leader, a man who commanded respect across tribal and state lines, and apparently, Tommy was his grandson. The riders were close enough now that Jake could see their faces. Serious, determined, not hostile, exactly, but not friendly either. Jake walked onto his front porch, Tommy beside him. The morning air was cool and clean after the storm. Puddles reflected the sky like scattered mirrors. The riders stopped about 50 yards from the house, waiting. Then one man rode forward, alone, older, weathered, wearing a mixture of traditional and modern clothing. His presence commanded attention without demanding it. This, Jake realized, was Chief Standing Bear. The chief dismounted and walked toward the porch. His steps were measured, deliberate. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years and wisdom. "My grandson tells me you fed him when he was dying," the chief said. No introduction, no small talk, just truth. Jake nodded. Any man would have done the same. Chief Standing Bear studied him for a long moment. "No," he said finally, "any man would not." Tommy ran to his grandfather, who lifted him easily despite his apparent age. The reunion was quiet but intense. Love without words. "He was lost for 3 days," the chief continued, still holding Tommy. "We searched everywhere, found nothing. Then last night, he came home, fed, cared for. Because of you." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "I just did what needed doing." "Yes," the chief said. "You did." The other riders remained motionless, watching, waiting for some signal Jake didn't understand. Chief Standing Bear set Tommy down and walked closer to Jake, close enough that Jake could see the lines around his eyes, the silver in his braided hair, the depth of character carved by decades of leadership. "In our tradition," the chief said, "such kindness creates obligation, not burden, honor." Jake wasn't sure what that meant, but he sensed it was important. "You have questions," the chief continued. "I will answer them. How did he get lost out there? Jake asked. The chief's expression darkened slightly. Tommy wandered from camp during a ceremony. By the time we noticed, a storm had washed away his tracks. We searched for 3 days with no success. He could have died out there. Yes, he was dying when you found him. Jake looked at Tommy, who was now surrounded by several of the riders. Family, Jake realized. They were treating him like something precious that had been returned from the dead. What happens now? Jake asked. Chief Standing Bear smiled for the first time. It transformed his entire face. Now, you learn what it means to be honored by the Crow Nation. That evening, Jake found himself sitting around a fire in his own backyard, surrounded by more people than his property had ever hosted. The Crow delegation had set up a temporary camp, and what had started as a rescue mission had become something else entirely, a celebration. Tommy sat between Jake and his grandfather, chattering excitedly about the pancakes, the storm, the way Jake's horse had carried him home. The fear and weakness were gone, replaced by the natural energy of a 7-year-old who felt safe again. He hasn't stopped talking about you, Chief Standing Bear told Jake quietly. The white cowboy who shared his food, who asked for nothing in return. Jake stared into the fire. It wasn't heroic, just human. Perhaps that's what made it heroic. As the evening progressed, Jake learned more about Tommy's family. His parents had died in a car accident 2 years ago. He lived with his grandfather now, along with several aunts and uncles. The tribe took care of its own. He also learned that his simple act of kindness had created something he'd never expected: respect. You will always be welcome among our people, Chief Standing Bear said as the fire burned low. This is not empty words. This is promise. Jake nodded, moved by the sincerity. I appreciate that. But he had no idea how deeply that promise would soon be tested. The next morning brought news that changed everything. There's trouble coming, Chief Standing Bear said, his face grim as he read a letter that had arrived by messenger. What kind of trouble? The Bureau of Indian Affairs. They're trying to force relocation again, move families off traditional lands, break up communities. Jake felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard rumors about such things, government officials deciding what was best for people who'd been managing their own affairs for centuries. When? Soon. They've already started with smaller tribes. We're next. Chief Standing Bear folded the letter carefully. They use legal words, make it sound reasonable. But it's the same old story. Take the land, scatter the people, destroy what cannot be rebuilt. Jake had grown up on stories of the Indian Wars. His grandfather had fought in them, but he'd always thought of that as history, ancient wrongs from a different time. Apparently, the wrongs weren't so ancient. Is there anything that can be done? Jake asked. The chief looked at him with something that might have been hope. Perhaps. If we have allies, if we have voices that others will hear. Jake understood. In 1970 for Montana, a white rancher's voice carried weight that a native chief's voice sometimes didn't. It wasn't right, but it was reality. What do you need? Jake asked. And with those 4 words, Jake Morrison went from being a simple cowboy who'd helped a lost child to being a bridge between 2 worlds that had been at odds for over a century. The real test was about to begin. The Bureau of Indian Affairs arrived on a Tuesday morning in 3 black government cars that looked like they were attending a funeral, which Jake thought grimly they probably were. Agent Harrison stepped out of the lead car, tall, thin, with the kind of pale complexion that suggested he spent more time behind a desk than under the Montana sky. His suit was expensive. His shoes were impractical. His smile was the sort that appeared only when necessary and disappeared the moment it wasn't. Behind him came 2 other agents and a man Jake recognized as County Commissioner Blake, a politician who'd never met a development deal he didn't like. Mr. Morrison, Agent Harrison said, extending a hand that felt cold and damp. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. Jake hadn't agreed to anything. They'd simply shown up and assumed he'd cooperate. But he shook the hand anyway, because his mother had raised him to be polite, even to people who didn't deserve it. What can I do for you, gentlemen? We understand you've had some contact with the local tribal community, Harrison said, pulling out a folder thick with official-looking documents. We'd like to discuss a matter of mutual interest." They'd been watching. Of course they had. Jake led them to his kitchen table, the same one where he'd fed Tommy soup 3 weeks ago. The contrast wasn't lost on him then. The table had been a place of healing. Now, it was about to become a battlefield. Harrison spread out maps and legal papers like a general planning an invasion. "The federal government is implementing a new rural development initiative," he began, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of someone who'd given this speech before. "Certain tribal lands have been identified as prime candidates for modernization. We're talking about real opportunities here: mining rights, agricultural development, tourism potential, the kind of progress that benefits everyone." Jake looked at the maps, red lines carved up traditional Crow territory like slices of pie, each slice labeled with potential uses. Coal mining sector A, agricultural development zone, recreational tourism district. "Where do the people go?" Jake asked. "We've identified several relocation sites." Commissioner Blake jumped in eagerly. "Modern housing developments, access to jobs, schools, healthcare. It's really a tremendous opportunity for these families to join the mainstream economy." Mainstream economy. Jake translated that in his head. "Give up everything you are to become what we want you to be. And if they don't want to relocate." Agent Harrison's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Well, that's where we hope concerned community members like yourself might help us explain the benefits. Your recent relationship with Chief Standing Bear could be very valuable in helping them understand that this is in their best interest." There it was, the real reason for their visit. They wanted Jake to be their messenger, to use the trust he'd earned through kindness to convince the Crow people to give up their homeland. Jake was quiet for a long moment, looking at the papers spread across his table. Outside, he could hear his cattle moving around the yard. Normal sounds of a normal day. Except nothing about this was normal. "How long do they have to decide?" he asked finally. 30 days, Harrison said. "The relocation notices are being served this afternoon. 30 days to abandon everything." Jake had taken longer to decide what truck to buy. "I'll need to think about this," Jake said. "Of course," Harrison replied, standing and gathering his papers. "But I hope you'll consider the bigger picture, Mr. Morrison. Progress requires difficult decisions. Sometimes we have to let go of the past to embrace the future." After they left, Jake sat at his empty table for a long time. Through the window, he could see dust clouds on the horizon, vehicles heading toward the reservation. The notices were being served. By evening, Chief Standing Bear was at Jake's door. The older man looked like he'd aged years in a single day. The weight of leadership, Jake realized, wasn't just an honor, it was a burden that could crush a man. "They came to you," the chief said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, and they want you to convince us to leave." Jake nodded. "They seem to think I have influence." Chief Standing Bear sat heavily in one of Jake's kitchen chairs. "Do you?" It was a fair question. Jake had shown kindness to one child, and somehow that had opened a door between two communities that had been separate for generations. "But influence, real influence, I don't know," Jake said honestly. "But I know what's right." "And what is right?" Jake looked at the maps the agents had left behind, still scattered on his table, red lines dividing up a way of life. "What's right is that nobody should have to choose between their home and their survival." Chief Standing Bear smiled sadly. "You would be surprised how often that choice is forced upon people." They talked long into the night, about history, about justice, about the kind of future they wanted for children like Tommy. And slowly, a plan began to form. It wasn't a legal plan. The government had all the legal authority it needed. It wasn't a political plan. The Crow Nation had little political power in Washington. It was something else entirely. It was a plan based on the one thing the government couldn't legislate away: the power of human connection. "We need witnesses," Jake said. "People who will see what's really happening here. Not the official version, the truth." "How do we get witnesses?" Jake smiled for the first time all day. "Leave that to me." The next morning, Jake made a series of phone calls. To his cousin who worked for the Great Falls Tribune, to a friend who'd gone to journalism school and now worked for a national magazine, to his old army buddy who'd become a documentary filmmaker. He told them the same thing: there's a story happening here that needs to be told." Within 48 hours, reporters began arriving in the area. Not many at first, but enough. And when they started asking questions, talking to tribal members, seeing the maps and relocation plans, the story began to spread. Local coverage became regional. Regional coverage became national coverage. And suddenly, the quiet efficiency of bureaucratic relocation was happening under bright lights. With cameras rolling, Agent Harrison was not pleased. "You're interfering with federal policy," he told Jake during a tense phone call. "I'm exercising my rights as a citizen," Jake replied. "Last I checked, this was still America." "Don't be naive, Morrison. This is bigger than one rancher's conscience." "Maybe, but it's not bigger than what's right." The pressure increased. Jake's banking contacts suddenly became less friendly. Permit applications for ranch improvements were delayed. His property taxes were reassessed. The message was clear: cooperate or face consequences. But Jake had been through hard times before, and more importantly, he wasn't fighting alone anymore. Tribal members began stopping by his ranch, not to ask for help, but to offer it. When his fence needed repair, willing hands appeared. When his cattle needed moving, experienced riders showed up. The two communities that had lived separately for decades began to work together, not because of government programs or official initiatives, but because one man had shared a bowl of soup with a hungry child, and that simple act had reminded everyone involved what it meant to be human. The confrontation came to a head during the formal hearing about the relocation order. The government had expected a small, quiet proceeding, tribal members making their case to largely empty chairs, then being politely overruled by bureaucratic authority. Instead, they found a packed courthouse, reporters with cameras, local ranchers and business owners who'd never set foot on the reservation, but who'd come to understand that what happened to their neighbors affected them too. Jake testified for nearly an hour, not as an expert on law or policy, but as a man who'd gotten to know his neighbors, who'd seen what community really looked like when people cared about each other. "These aren't just statistics on a government report," he said, looking directly at Agent Harrison. "These are families, people with roots that go back generations. You can relocate their bodies, but you can't relocate their hearts." When he finished, the courtroom was absolutely silent. Then Tommy stood up. All 40 pounds of him, wearing his best shirt and the shoes his grandmother had polished that morning. He walked to the front of the courtroom and looked up at the judge. "Sir," he said in his clear, young voice, "Mr. Jake saved my life, and he's trying to save all of us now. That's what good people do. They don't give up on each other." The judge, a graying man who'd probably heard every argument imaginable during his career, looked down at Tommy for a long moment. Then he looked at the government lawyers, at the maps, at the room full of people who'd come to bear witness. "I'm going to take this under advisement," he said finally. "Court is adjourned." Outside, reporters swarmed both sides. Agent Harrison pushed through the crowd without comment, but Jake could see the frustration in his rigid posture. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like it might be winnable. That night, as Jake sat on his porch listening to the prairie wind, Chief Standing Bear joined him. "Whatever happens," the chief said, "you've given us something we didn't have before." "What's that?" "Hope," Jake nodded. "Watching stars appear in the darkening sky. Sometimes that's all it takes." But both men knew the real test was still coming. 3 months later, Jake Morrison stood in the same courtroom, but everything had changed. The national attention had done what local protests couldn't. Congressional representatives had started asking questions. Media coverage had made the relocation effort a political liability. And most importantly, the story of a cowboy and a native boy had captured the public imagination in a way that statistics and policy papers never could. Judge Edwards delivered his ruling on a crisp November morning that felt like the edge of winter. After careful consideration of all evidence and testimony, he said, his voice carrying the weight of precedent, "This court finds that the proposed relocation lacks sufficient justification for the disruption it would cause to established communities." Jake felt the tension in the courtroom release like a collective exhale. Furthermore, the judge continued, The court is impressed by the demonstrated cooperation and mutual support between tribal and non-tribal communities in this region. This suggests that economic development and cultural preservation are not mutually exclusive goals. Agent Harrison's face was stone. Commissioner Blake was already packing his briefcase, clearly eager to distance himself from a losing cause. But Jake barely heard the legal language. He was watching Tommy, who sat between his grandfather and grandmother, grinning like Christmas morning. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked Jake for a statement. He kept it simple. Sometimes doing the right thing isn't complicated, he said. You just have to be willing to do it. That evening, the Crow Nation held a celebration feast, not on Jake's property this time, but on tribal land, in a large gathering hall filled with the sounds of drums, laughter, and children playing. Jake felt out of place at first. He was still the only white face in a sea of native families. But Tommy grabbed his hand and pulled him into the circle. And suddenly, it didn't matter what he looked like or where he'd come from. What mattered was that he'd stood up when it counted. Chief Standing Bear called for quiet as the feast wound down. When he spoke, his voice carried the formal tone of ceremony. Today we honor a man who showed us that courage comes in many forms, he said, looking directly at Jake. Sometimes it's the warrior who fights the enemy. Sometimes it's the man who feeds a hungry child. He paused, letting the words settle. Jake Morrison could have walked away. He could have minded his own business. Instead, he chose to see our struggles as his struggles, our children as his children, our future as his future. The chief picked up a carefully wrapped bundle from the table beside him. In our tradition, such a man becomes family, not by blood, but by choice, by action, by the content of his heart. He unwrapped a beautiful feathered headdress, clearly old and precious. This belonged to my grandfather and his grandfather before him. It has been worn by men who led our people through the darkest times, men who never gave up hope. Jake felt his throat tighten. He'd never expected anything like this. Today, it is yours, Chief Standing Bear said, placing the headdress carefully in Jake's hands. Not to wear casually, but to remember. Remember that when people stand together, no force on earth can move them. The hall erupted in cheers and applause. Tommy bounced up and down, clapping his hands. Jake looked down at the headdress, feeling the weight of its history, the responsibility it represented. I don't know what to say, he admitted. Say you'll remember. Chief Standing Bear replied. Say you'll keep standing up. Say you'll keep showing young people like Tommy what it means to be a good man. Jake nodded, his voice thick with emotion. I promise. As the celebration continued around them, Jake found himself thinking about how much had changed since that day he'd found a dying boy in the prairie grass. He'd started out just trying to help one child. Somehow, he'd ended up helping preserve an entire way of life. But maybe that's how real change always happened. Not through grand gestures or political speeches, but through small acts of kindness that rippled outward in ways no one could predict. Tommy appeared at his elbow, tugging on his sleeve. Mr. Jake, the boy said, my grandfather says you're family now. What do you think about that? Jake asked. Tommy grinned. I think it's about time. 5 years later, Jake Morrison's ranch had become something unique in Montana, a bridge between worlds. Tribal members regularly helped with roundups and barn raising. Jake's cattle grazed on leased tribal land during dry summers. Children from both communities played together at the annual Harvest Festival, held alternately on the reservation and at Jake's ranch. The relocation program had been quietly shelved after several other communities followed the model established in Montana. The story of the cowboy and the native boy had become a case study in successful community organizing. But for Jake, the real success was simpler and more personal. It was Tommy, now 12 years old, teaching Jake how to braid horsehair. It was Chief Standing Bear stopping by for coffee and conversation on Sunday mornings. It was the knowledge that when his neighbors needed help, they called him, and when he needed help, they came running. The headdress hung in a place of honor in Jake's living room, a reminder of the day he'd learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about showing up. It's about caring enough to act. It's about recognizing that in a world full of division, the choice to connect is revolutionary. On This particular evening, as Jake sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the prairie gold, Tommy rode up on his pony. "My grandfather sent me," the boy said, dismounting with the easy grace of someone born to horses. "He wants to know if you'll come to dinner Sunday. My aunt's making fry bread. Wouldn't miss it," Jake said. Tommy grinned and remounted, but before riding away, he paused. Double quotes, "Mr. Jake, I've been thinking about that day you found me. What about it? Do you think it was luck, or do you think it was supposed to happen?" Jake considered the question seriously. Tommy was old enough now for serious answers. "I think," Jake said finally, "that the world is full of chances to do the right thing. Most people just don't take them. But you did. That time, yes, but every day brings new chances. For all of us." Tommy nodded thoughtfully. "I want to take them too, when I'm older." "You already are," Jake said. "Every time you're kind to someone, every time you stand up for what's right, every time you choose to connect instead of divide." As Tommy rode away in the gathering dusk, Jake felt a deep sense of contentment. Not the contentment of a job finished, but of a purpose fulfilled, somewhere in the distance. Drums were beating softly, not for ceremony this time, but for the simple joy of music shared among friends. Jake smiled and went inside to prepare for another day. Another chance to do the right thing. Another opportunity to prove that in a world that often seemed determined to pull people apart, the choice to come together was still the most powerful force of all. The boy he'd found dying in the grass had become a bridge to understanding. The simple act of sharing food had grown into a community transformed. And Jake Morrison, a quiet cowboy who'd never asked to be anyone's hero, had learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the smallest gestures cast the longest shadows. Sometimes kindness changes everything. And sometimes when you feed one hungry child, you end up nourishing an entire world.